This is the fall of a fortress that held a warp storm shut for 10,000 years, and the 6 acts of the battle that finally broke it. There is no chronometer log for this fight. No published record hands us a real minute-by-minute transcript. What we have instead is the order it happened in, the acts in sequence, the way the campaign material lays them out. So when we say minute by minute here, we mean something specific, not a stopwatch, but a structure, 6 acts. Each one closer to the moment a single planet stopped being a fortress and became a scar in the sky. Start with why anyone would fight this hard for one world. Cadia is not a rich world. It has no famous shrines, no unique manufactorum output the rest of the Imperium can't live without. What Cadia has is a location. It sits inside something called the Cadian Gate, the one stable, navigable route through the worst of the warp turbulence that surrounds the Eye of Terror. Everywhere else along that boundary, the warp is close to impassable, storms that shred ships and drive crews mad before they arrive. Cadia's system is the exception. It's the door, and on the other side of that door is the largest, oldest concentration of chaos-aligned forces in the setting, the Eye of Terror, the region chaos has held since before the Imperium as we know it existed. Every Black Crusade, every attempt by the forces of chaos to break out into the wider galaxy in force, has to come through the gate or find another way around it, and there mostly isn't another way around it. That is what makes Cadia matter, not its resources, its geometry. So the Imperium did what the Imperium does with a strategic chokepoint. It turned an entire planet into a weapon. Cadia's population is not raised the way most Imperial worlds raise people. From birth, Cadians are folded into a military culture built around one purpose, manning the gate. The world is physically organized around fortress cities called casas, hardened strongpoints linked into a defense grid that has absorbed, by the time of this story, 10,000 years of continuous pressure. Every prior Black Crusade Abaddon the Despoiler has launched, and there have been many, has broken against Cadia and failed to take it. Cadia's entire identity, on a civilizational scale, is the world that does not fall. That reputation is the setup for everything that follows, because this time someone changes the terms. Before we get to that, it's worth understanding exactly what a Cadian childhood looks like, because it explains why this defense was ever credible in the first place. Cadian children grow up with weapons drills as a normal part of schooling. Military service isn't a career choice for most of the population, it's closer to a life stage everyone passes through, the way other worlds treat schooling or apprenticeship. The regiments raised from Cadia, the Cadian shock troops, are considered among the most reliable, disciplined infantry the Astra Militarum fields anywhere in the Imperium, and that reputation isn't marketing. It's the product of a planet that has spent 10,000 years treating soldiering as its primary civic identity, the way another world might organize itself around a cathedral or a forge. When Imperial commanders elsewhere in the galaxy need dependable line infantry, Cadian regiments are the standard people measure other regiments against. That's the population this story is about, not a garrison assigned to a fortress. A civilization built, generation after generation, to be the fortress, and it's worth understanding briefly who's been trying to break that fortress for 10,000 years, because the 13th attempt doesn't happen in a vacuum. Abaddon the Despoiler was once first captain of the Sons of Horus, one of the Primarch Horus's most trusted officers during the Horus Heresy, the galaxy-spanning civil war that nearly destroyed the Imperium at its founding, and left the Emperor himself entombed on the Golden Throne rather than dead outright. When Horus fell and the heresy ended in defeat for the traitor legions, Abaddon didn't vanish into the Eye of Terror to lick his wounds forever. He spent the following millennia rebuilding, consolidating the scattered remnants of the old traitor legions and countless warbands under the banner of the Black Legion, and periodically launching massive offensives out of the Eye, the Black Crusades, each one probing for a way to break the Imperium's containment of chaos for good. By the count the setting uses, this is the 13th such crusade, and every one of the previous 12, at various points, has run into Cadia and failed to get past it. That's not incidental to how this story should land. Abaddon isn't a new enemy trying something for the first time and getting lucky. He's the single most persistent, most patient enemy this fortress has ever faced. A commander who has had 10,000 years to study exactly how Cadia wins, and who finally, on attempt 13, stops trying to win the fight Cadia is built to win, and brings a different fight instead. Act 1. The reason this crusade is different. Abaddon the Despoiler has spent centuries building toward a 13th Black Crusade, and by the time it launches, he is carrying two things that matter for what happens at Cadia. The first is the Talon of Horus, a weapon with a legacy stretching back to the Horus heresy. The second is Dracina, a blade with its own dark reputation in the fiction. Neither of those is what breaks Cadia by itself. What breaks Cadia is a third asset, something the Black Legion and its allies bring into the system that Cadia's 10,000 years of defense doctrine was never built to answer. A Blackstone Fortress. Picture what that actually looks like from the perspective of a defender in orbit. Conventional siege warfare against a fortress world follows a rhythm everyone in this fight has trained for their whole lives. Void shield generators absorbing incoming fire in visible, measurable increments. Auger arrays tracking incoming ordnance with enough lead time to plot intercepts. Void combat that, however brutal, obeys physics everyone understands. A Blackstone Fortress doesn't play by that rhythm. Its bombardment draws on warp energy directly, which means the thing hitting your shields isn't behaving like conventional macro cannon fire or lance strikes. It's closer to having a weapon fired at you from outside the rules the rest of the engagement is being fought under. Shields calibrated for one kind of physics meeting an attack built on another. That mismatch is why this weapon does in one crusade what 12 previous ones couldn't do at all. Blackstone fortresses are ancient, war-scale installations, older than the Imperium, capable of firing weapons that draw directly on warp energy, bombardment on a scale a conventional void fleet cannot match. Chaos forces bring one to bear against the Cadian system, and it starts doing what void shields and conventional orbital defense were never designed to stop. This is Act 1, not a fleet action in the way Cadia's commanders have trained for 1,000 years to fight fleet actions, but a weapon from outside that entire tradition, aimed at the gate. It's worth pausing on what a Blackstone Fortress actually is, because the weapon matters as much as the general wielding it. These installations predate the Imperium of Man. Their origin is tied to the same ancient conflicts that also produced the Eye of Terror's warp instability in the first place. They are old enough, and strange enough, that even the Imperium's own archives treat them as half-legend. What makes one relevant to a fight over a fortress world is specific. Its main weapon doesn't just hit hard, it draws on the warp directly, which means it isn't just another kind of orbital gun. It's a category of threat that the entire architecture of Cadia's void shields, its layered defense doctrine, its 10,000 years of institutional memory about how sieges go, was never built around. Abaddon isn't trying to outfight Cadia's defenses on their own terms. He's changing what the fight is. Meanwhile, on the other side of the galaxy, something else is already in motion that will matter later. Robert Guilliman, a Primarch, dead in every meaningful sense since the Horus heresy, kept in stasis for 10,000 years, has been revived. His return sets the Indomitus Crusade moving, a relief effort racing toward Cadia. Keep that in the back of your mind through everything that follows, because the entire tragedy of this battle is a timing problem. Help is coming, it does not arrive in time to save the planet. It arrives in time to matter for what comes after, but not for Cadia itself. There's a bitter irony worth naming here. Guilliman's return is, in the broader story of this era, framed as one of the great hopeful turns for the Imperium, a Primarch back on his feet after 10 millennia, bringing organizational competence the setting has been starved of for that entire span. And the first major test of that hope is a race against the clock that hope loses, not because Guilliman is too slow in any personal sense, but because the distances involved are genuinely galactic, and Cadia's crisis moves faster than any fleet, however well led, can close that gap. The Indomitus Crusade is not a failure. It's just late to the one battle where lateness costs everything. It's worth placing this battle next to the other sieges this setting is famous for, because the comparison sharpens exactly what makes Cadia different. Warhammer 40,000 has no shortage of legendary defensive stands, worlds and fortresses that hold against overwhelming odds and become legends for exactly that reason, endurance itself treated as the victory condition. What almost all of those stories share is a shape. Brutal, costly, but ultimately survivable. The defenders bloodied, but the fortress still standing when the guns finally go quiet. Cadia was built, culturally and materially, to be the platonic ideal of that shape, the fortress that always, eventually, still stands. The 13th Black Crusade isn't just a harder version of that familiar story. It's the one time the setting lets that shape actually break, and it breaks it at the exact location most identified with the shape holding. That's not a coincidence in terms of storytelling, it's the point. If the model fortress can fall, the lesson is that nothing is actually guaranteed, no matter how many centuries of precedent say otherwise. Act 2, the ground and the grid. While the Blackstone Fortress works on Cadia's void defenses from orbit, the ground war is its own enormous engagement. Cadian shock troop regiments, the planet's entire reason for existing, made flesh, deploy along the Casra network. Lord Castellan Ursarkar E. Creed, the senior Cadian commander, and by this point a figure with a legendary reputation across the Imperium for his defense of this exact world in prior crusades, leads the ground defense. He is joined by elements of the Adeptus Astartes. Multiple Space Marine chapters answer the call to Cadia, because everyone in the Imperium understands, at least in outline, what losing the gate would mean. Sisters of Battle contingents engage as well. The Imperial Navy holds what orbital space it can hold against a bombardment platform that outmatches almost anything they have. The campaign material describes the scale of this engagement in terms that resist a clean headcount, forces numbering in the millions, engagements across an entire system, described by Games Workshop's own campaign framing as combat on a scale that defies exact accounting. We're not going to hand you a precise casualty figure here, because the source material doesn't hand us one either, and inventing false precision on top of beyond counting would be worse than just saying it plainly. This is one of the largest single engagements the setting depicts in its modern era, and nobody was keeping an exact tally while it happened. What matters for the shape of the story is this: the ground defense, for all its scale, is not what decides the battle. The Casra network was built to survive artillery, invasion, siege, orbital bombardment of a conventional kind. It was not built to survive what's coming next. It's worth being specific about what the Casra network means, because it's not one fortress, it's dozens, spread across Cadia and its companion world Cadia Secundus, each one a hardened city in its own right, linked by supply lines, communication relays, and interlocking fields of fire designed so that no single Casra falls without the others being able to respond. This is a defense-in-depth doctrine, refined over 10,000 years of actual combat experience, not theory. Every prior Black Crusade taught the Cadian military something, and by the 13th, that accumulated doctrine is about as mature as siege warfare gets anywhere in the setting. Creed himself is the living embodiment of that doctrine, a commander who has personally defended this exact ground against Abaddon before, more than once, and won. That history is precisely why this battle reads as such a departure from the pattern: the same commander, the same doctrine, the same fortress network that has succeeded again and again, meeting an opponent who has finally brought something those 10,000 years never accounted for. There's another layer to the ground fight worth pulling out separately, because it says something about how the whole Imperium reads this battle in the moment, not just in hindsight. The decision by multiple Space Marine chapters to commit forces to Cadia isn't a routine reinforcement. Space Marine chapters are fiercely autonomous, typically operating within their own patrol zones and answering crisis calls selectively, weighed against their own chapter's priorities and losses. A multi-chapter response converging on one system is the setting's shorthand for everyone who understands the stakes agrees this is existential. The same goes for the Adeptus Sororitas deployment. The orders militant of the Sisters of Battle don't scatter their strength casually, and their presence at Cadia is one more signal, read correctly by anyone paying attention at the time, that this crusade is being taken as seriously as anything the Imperium has faced in living memory. Nobody committing forces to this fight believes yet that the fortress itself might not survive it. They're reinforcing a world they still expect to win. Act 3, the desperate answer. Somewhere beneath Cadia, buried in antiquity, unknown to most of the population living on top of them, there are necron pylons. This is not something the Cadians built. It's something ancient alien technology that predates the Imperium's presence on this world entirely, left there for reasons the setting keeps deliberately murky, and which turns out to have a specific, narrow, extremely relevant function. These structures can act against warp energy on a massive scale, which is exactly the kind of weapon a Blackstone Fortress is using against them. Faced with a bombardment platform that conventional defenses cannot counter, Imperial forces, knowingly gambling with something they do not fully understand or control, activate the pylons. This is Act 3, and it's the hinge of the entire story. It's a desperation play. It works, in the narrow sense that it answers the Blackstone Fortress's warp-based assault. It does not work in any sense that leaves Cadia intact. It's worth dwelling on how strange it is that this option even exists. The necron pylons were not installed by any authority currently governing Cadia. Necrons in this setting are an ancient, mechanized species that predates human civilization by a margin the setting mostly declines to quantify precisely, slumbering across the galaxy in tomb worlds for unimaginable stretches of time, occasionally waking. Nobody currently alive on Cadia built these structures, chose their location, or fully understood their operational limits when the crisis began. They were simply there, a piece of infrastructure left behind by a civilization whose motives remain opaque, discovered and repurposed by desperate people who had run out of doctrine to fall back on. That's a detail that should sit uncomfortably, because it means the technology that ultimately ends Cadia's 10,000-year run wasn't a flaw in the Imperium's own defenses. It was a gamble on someone else's leftover machinery, taken because the alternative was worse. Stop and notice what kind of decision this actually is. The people making the call to activate technology they did not build, do not fully understand, and cannot fully predict, are not doing so out of ignorance or recklessness for its own sake. They are doing it because the alternative in front of them, a Blackstone Fortress continuing to fire warp-drawn bombardment into a system with no answer to it, is a certainty of loss, while the pylons are at least a chance. That's the logic of every desperation gambit in this setting's long history. When the certain path leads to defeat, an uncertain path that might not is the rational choice, even when might not turns out to include or it might destroy everything you're trying to save. Nobody at that decision point knows, in the moment, that they are about to end a 10,000-year-old world. They know they are out of good options, and this is the option left. Act 4. The world comes apart. This is the part of the story that separates Cadia loses a battle from Cadia stops existing. The pylon activation, set against the ongoing Blackstone Fortress bombardment, and the overall violence being done to the system, destabilizes catastrophically. Cadia isn't captured, it isn't occupied, it is torn apart. The planet itself, the fortress world, the Kaz, the 10,000-year defense grid, the population raised from birth to hold this exact ground, breaks apart in the climax of the battle. There's a physical dimension to torn apart, worth being precise about, as far as the source material allows precision. This isn't a world reduced to rubble the way a bombed city is rubble, with structures standing shattered but the ground beneath them intact. The scale of destabilization here operates on the level of the planet's own geology and structural integrity, the kind of catastrophic failure that turns a world from a single coherent body into fragments. Whatever specific mechanism the pylons and the Blackstone Fortress's warp energies interacted through, the result described in the campaign material is planetary-scale disintegration, not planetary-scale damage. That distinction matters for understanding why there was no salvage operation, no reconstruction effort, no Cadia rebuilt storyline waiting in the wings the way there might be for a world merely devastated by war. There was, quite literally, decreasingly less of a planet left to rebuild. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it inverts the entire premise the video opened with. Cadia's whole identity was the world that does not fall. It doesn't fall in the way a world falls to invasion and occupation. It's worse than that. There's no Cadia left to have fallen to anyone. The choke point that justified 10,000 years of a planet's entire civilization being organized around one military function simply stops being there. There's a specific narrative cruelty in how this plays out that's worth naming directly. Every previous Black Crusade against Cadia followed a recognizable shape. Chaos attacks, the fortress holds, the attackers withdraw, Cadia repairs and rearms and waits for the next one. That cycle, repeated across 10,000 years, is what built the reputation in the first place, a world that survives by enduring, not by winning outright. because enduring is winning when you're the door nobody else can close. The 13th Black Crusade breaks that cycle not by finally landing a harder version of the same kind of blow, but by introducing a category of destruction the cycle was never designed to survive at all. It isn't a bigger siege. It's a different kind of ending, one where hold the line one more time stops being an available move. Act 5, The Wound in the Sky. Cadia's destruction doesn't stay a local catastrophe. It's the trigger, the proximate cause, in the setting's own framing, for something on a galaxy-spanning scale, the tearing open of the Great Rift, also called the Cicatrix Maledictum. This is a warp storm on a scale the setting had not depicted before this event, and it does something extraordinarily blunt to the map of the Imperium. It splits the galaxy roughly in half. Regions that were reachable by astropathic communication and navigator-guided travel are suddenly cut off from each other for an unknown duration. Entire sectors go dark, not because they were destroyed, but because the road there no longer exists in any usable form. This is why the fall of Cadia isn't really a story about one planet, even though the planet is where it happens. It's the origin event for what the setting calls the Era Indomitus, the current chapter of the Warhammer 40,000 timeline, defined by a galaxy that has been physically cut in two. Every faction, every campaign, every strategic calculation across the setting from this point forward has to account for the Great Rift. One battle, at one world, at one strategic choke point, produces a wound that reshapes the entire galactic map. The practical consequences of that split are worth spelling out, because the galaxy is cut in half, can sound abstract until you translate it into what it means for the people living in it. Astropathic communication, the setting's version of interstellar messaging, reliant on psychers relaying thought across the warp, becomes wildly unreliable or impossible across huge stretches of space now sitting inside or adjacent to the rift. Navigators, who plot warp routes by reading a fixed astronomical beacon, find that beacon itself distorted or unreadable in affected regions. That means fleets can be stranded, sectors can go from a 6-month voyage away to, we genuinely do not know if you can get there at all right now. Entire Imperial holdings on the far side of the rift are effectively cut off from Terra's authority and support for the indefinite future, left to survive, or not, on their own. That's the actual, lived-in scale of what one fortress world's destruction sets off. Not a symbolic wound, an operational one, felt by every world that used to be able to call for help and now might not be able to. Act 6. What's left standing, and what isn't? Ursarkar E. Creed's fate at the end of this battle is genuinely unconfirmed. The material doesn't hand us a body or a clean death scene, and that's deliberate. This is a setting that likes to leave its legends in exactly that kind of ambiguity. What we can say honestly is that the last confirmed accounts have him making a final stand on a world that is coming apart around him. Whether he died there, whether he was pulled out, whether some other fate found him, the record doesn't close that door, so we're not going to pretend it does either. What we can say with more confidence is what happens to the people who survive. Cadia's population, or what's left of it, becomes a diaspora, survivors scattered and absorbed into other Imperial forces, other regiments, other worlds. Cadian shock troops as a distinct, self-renewing regiment tied to a living homeworld effectively ends here, because the homeworld that renewed them is gone, and the Cadian Gate itself, the entire reason this planet existed as a fortress in the first place, is permanently compromised. The Imperium's containment of the Eye of Terror is not what it was 10,000 years ago, and it will not be again. There's also a command-level consequence worth naming before we move past the aftermath. The loss of Cadia forces a reorganization of Imperial Guard doctrine that has nothing to do with any single battle plan, and everything to do with recruitment math. For 10,000 years, one of the most dependable, highest reputation sources of frontline infantry in the entire Imperium was a single world that could be relied upon to keep producing disciplined shock troop regiments generation after generation, largely without needing central intervention to make that happen. That source is gone. Every theater of war that used to be able to requisition Cadian regiments with confidence in what it was getting now has to look elsewhere, work with less proven quantities, or make do with fewer reinforcements altogether. That's not a dramatic, single-scene consequence the way the planet's destruction is. It's a slow, grinding one. the kind of loss that shows up not in a headline battle, but in 100 smaller battles across the following years, fought by regiments that are competent but aren't Cadian, on fronts that would have gotten Cadian support if Cadia still existed to send it. Think about what that diaspora actually means for the individual people inside it. These are soldiers whose entire cultural identity was built around a specific piece of ground, a caste, a defense line, a home system with a name and a location on a star chart. That ground is gone, not conquered and renamed, not occupied by an enemy garrison they can someday dream of retaking. Gone, in the sense that there is no longer a there. Survivors get folded into regiments on other worlds, serving under other worlds' banners, carrying a Cadian identity that has become, in a strange and permanent way, homeless. Later material in the setting continues to track Cadian as a marker of origin and reputation long after the world itself stops existing, which tells you something about how deeply that identity was built to outlast any single battle, even the one that ended the planet. The Indomitus Crusade, Guilliman's relief force, arrives after the fact. Too late to save Cadia. Not too late to matter, because a galaxy that's just been cut in half by the largest warp storm in its history needs exactly the kind of large-scale, urgent reorganization Guilliman is built to provide. The Crusade pivots from relieve Cadia to something closer to hold the pieces of a broken galaxy together, and that pivot defines the era that follows. One more thing worth being straightforward about, because it's the kind of detail a channel covering this material owes its audience honestly rather than smoothing over. Warhammer 40,000 as a game and a setting has gone through multiple edition changes since this event was first published, and army compositions, unit availability, and even some background framing have shifted in the years since. Some of those shifts touch on exactly the kind of detail this video covers, how Cadian as a distinct, separate identity is represented going forward, for instance, has been handled differently across different points in the game's ongoing publication history. We're not going to guess at specific edition dates or specific rules changes we can't verify in this pass, because getting that kind of detail wrong is worse than leaving it open. What we can say is that the core narrative beats, the Blackstone Fortress, the pylon activation, Cadia's destruction, the Great Rift's opening, have remained the settled version of this event across everything published since. That's the spine we've followed here. It's also worth noting what this battle did to the broader shape of Imperial strategy, beyond just the loss of one world. Every major Imperial military doctrine that assumed the Cadian Gate as a fixed, reliable chokepoint had to be rewritten. Fleet deployments that used to treat Watch the Gate as sufficient containment for the entire Eye of Terror now have to account for a compromised, unstable region with no single reliable strongpoint holding it shut. That's a strategic headache that ripples outward for every Imperial commander making deployment decisions from this point in the timeline forward, one less certainty in a galaxy that was already short on them. There's a wider galactic politics dimension to this that's easy to miss if you only follow the human Imperium side thread. Cadia wasn't just an Imperial asset. The Cadian Gate mattered to every faction with a stake in what comes through the Eye of Terror, which is most of them, one way or another. Xenos empires that had learned to root around Cadian space, or to treat the Gate as a known, stable hazard to be avoided, now have to contend with a region whose behavior is no longer predictable. The Great Rift doesn't just cut off Imperial sectors from each other, it redraws the operational map for anyone doing business anywhere near that boundary, ally or enemy alike. Some of the setting's other major factions treat the post-Rift galaxy as an opportunity. Moving into space, the weakened, divided Imperium can no longer defend as reliably. Others find their own supply and communication lines just as disrupted as the Imperium's. A single fortress world's destruction turning into a galaxy-wide strategic reset, felt by factions who had nothing to do with the battle itself, is about as large as consequence gets in this setting, and it's one more reason this event keeps getting treated as the hinge point it is, rather than filed away as one more lost world in a franchise that has lost plenty of worlds before. There's a longer legacy worth tracing here too, because the fall of Cadia doesn't stay a closed chapter, the setting keeps returning to it. Subsequent campaigns and storylines, set in the era Indomitus, regularly reference the Great Rift as an active, ongoing condition of the galaxy rather than a one-time event that's since been resolved. Sectors on the far side of the rift, cut off since this battle, remain cut off in material published well after it, some of them the subject of their own campaign books exploring exactly what abandoned by the wider Imperium looks like for the people actually living through it. Newly raised regiments across the Imperium continue to carry Cadian veterans, Cadian training doctrine, and Cadian unit naming conventions into the current era, a kind of institutional afterlife for a world that no longer exists on any star chart. The fortress is gone, its methods aren't. It's also worth being honest about one more thing before we close this out. Why this particular battle gets told and retold as a turning point rather than just another entry in a long list of Imperial defeats, of which the setting has no shortage. Part of it is scale. A galaxy visibly cut in half is a rare kind of setting-wide consequence, the sort of thing that changes the premise of every story told afterward rather than just the fortunes of one front. But part of it is also that Cadia was never just a fortress. It was the setting's proof that endurance could function as a kind of victory, that you could hold a line for 10,000 years without ever needing to win outright, as long as you never let go. Losing that proof is a different order of loss than losing territory. It's losing a piece of how the Imperium was allowed to think about itself, as an empire that, whatever else was collapsing around it, could always point to Cadia and say the door is still shut. After this battle, nobody gets to say that anymore, so here's the shape of it, laid end to end. A world built for 10,000 years around one strategic function, a crusade that brings a weapon outside that world's entire defensive tradition, a desperate, ancient countermeasure that answers the immediate threat and destroys the world in the process. A destruction that doesn't stay contained to one system but tears a wound across the galaxy itself. And an aftermath where the thing that made this planet matter, the gate, survives only as a compromised, unstable version of what it used to be, guarded now by people who are not Cadians, because there mostly aren't Cadians left to guard it. We opened by telling you there's no real clock for this battle, no published timestamp record turning it into an actual minute-by-minute account. That's true, and it's worth repeating at the end instead of pretending otherwise. What the source material gives us is order, not duration. This happened, then this, then this. We've walked it in that order, 6 acts, from a fortress world's 10,000-year reputation to a scar across the galactic map that every faction in this setting still has to navigate around today. One last thing worth sitting with, because it's the detail that tends to get lost under the scale of everything else in this story. Every act we've walked through, the Blackstone Fortress, the ground defense, the pylon gambit, the planet's destruction, the rift, the diaspora, happened to real people inside the fiction, on a timescale that, however uncertain in its exact minutes, was still lived through in real time by soldiers who had spent their entire lives training for exactly this fight and did not know, walking into it, that this was the one their training couldn't answer. That's true of Creed, whose fate the record still won't confirm. It's true of every Cadian regiment that shipped out to defend a casa that no longer exists. It's true of the Monitorum clerks, the Navy crews, the sisters and Astartes who committed to a fight they believed, going in, was winnable in the way every previous one had been winnable. The scale of this event is galaxy-spanning. The experience of it, for the people inside it, was as immediate and personal as any single soldier's worst day. Both of those things are true at once, and a story this large loses something if it only tells you the first one. Cadia didn't lose a battle. It stopped being a place a map could point to, and the door it used to guard is still standing open.